Members of APEC should be referred to as member economies or members or economies. Please do not use in reference to APEC member economies the words country, nation, or national. Thank you once again for your cooperation. We will start the webinar in just a few minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will start today's webinar in just a few minutes. Thank you for your patience. Today's webinar will begin in just a few minutes. Once again, thank you for your patience. Ladies and gentlemen, participants joining us online, welcome to the webinar on Public-Private Dialogue on Digitally Enabled Services. My name is Linda, your MC for today. Today's webinar is organized by the Bureau of Foreign Trade under the Ministry of Economic Affairs of Chinese Taipei and executed by Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to increasing use of services supported by or based on the internet. Today's webinar aims to share government policies and measures on digitally enabled services and enable industry players to harness digital technologies to enhance their competitiveness. In today's webinar, we will first present the factual information and key findings of the APEC-wide survey conducted by Chinese Taipei during May to June in 2022. Then we will learn about the public sector perspectives on recent developments and practices in digitally enabled services from healthcare, education, financial, and public sectors, as well as experience sharing and policy recommendations from the private sector, followed by a panel discussion. Before we begin, we would like to remind all participants to please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. If you have any questions or comments over the course of today's webinar, please use the chat room to leave your questions and comments. We will invite the speakers to address them during the Q&A session. To kick off today's webinar, please join me in welcoming the host of the webinar, Ms. Cynthia Zhang, Director General of the Bureau of Foreign Trade, Ministry of Economic Affairs of Chinese Taipei, to give her welcoming remarks.
Distinguished speakers and participants, on behalf of the Bureau of Foreign Trade, under the Ministry of Economic Affairs of Chinese Taipei, I'm very delighted to join you today and cordially welcome all of you. Digital technologies have significantly changed the ways of doing businesses. In particular, the pandemic has accelerated this process. The use of online services, particularly in sectors such as healthcare, finance, education, and public services, has become more and more popular. Enterprises have endeavored to provide services online in response to the pandemic. On the other hand, governments have adopted various measures promoting digitally enabled services. For example, in Chinese Taipei, we have permanently relaxed the measures on allowing insurers to provide consumers with convenient and secure online procedures for handling insurance purchases and relevant services. In this context, we propose to hold a public-private dialogue. A pre-event survey was conducted to learn about the status of member economies' policies and measures before, during, and after the pandemic. The key findings of the survey and today's discussion will contribute to the policy recommendation as reference for APEC members. Additionally, it will enable small and medium-sized enterprises to develop digital technologies. Through this PPD, we also hope to make substantive contributions to the implementation of the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, ASCR, and intensify our future work on synergy between the ASCR and digitalization. The rapid development of online services requires a sound regulatory framework to address the challenges, such as measures concerning cross-border data flow and personal data protection. In this regard, we acknowledge the importance of ongoing negotiations on the WTO's JSI on electronic commerce to create a conducive environment for businesses and consumers online and help unlock opportunities for digitalization. Today, we're very honored to have speakers from the WTO, from OECD, governments, and prominent enterprises in the region. Their views and experiences are always valuable and inspiring for our work in APEC. I would like to thank all member economies and the APEC Secretariat for your support. I'm very confident this webinar will be fruitful, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Zhang, for the opening remarks. Now we would like to take this opportunity to invite all speakers and moderators to join us for an online group photo. So may we invite all speakers and moderators to please switch on your camera for this group photo. And we are going to have a screenshot of all the speakers and moderators joining us today. All right, so I see all the speakers and moderators are turning on their camera. So can I invite our speakers and moderators to please a big smile into the camera so they'll have a screenshot for everyone. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you. And we would also like to thank all the speakers and moderators for taking time out of your busy schedule to joining us today from different time zones. I understand that some of you are either joining these webinars very early in the morning or very late at night. So once again, thank you for your participation. As we move on to the first session, we would like to remind all speakers that each speaker will have 10 minutes for your presentation. And for our online participants, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat room. We will collect them and invite our speakers to address them during the Q&A session. We will now move on to the first session today, which focuses on the public sector perspectives, creating a sound regulatory environment for digitally enabled services. The moderator for this session is Mr. Thomas Fine. Mr. Thomas Fine is the convener of APEC Group on Services and also the Director of Services and Investment at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representatives. Mr. Fine has extensive experience in trade negotiation. He is the lead services and financial services negotiator for US-UK FTA, U.S. lead delegate to APEC Investment Expert Group and APEC Group on Services, U.S. representative in the WTO Joint Statement Initiative negotiations on domestic regulations, and the lead services negotiator in TTIP. He is also the financial services lead in TISA negotiations. Without further ado, I will now hand the floor to our moderator, Mr. Thomas Fine. Mr. Fine, the floor is yours.
Very much, Linda, and hello and welcome to all of the speakers and participants in this public-private dialogue. Welcome to this first panel of the dialogue on the challenges and opportunities of digitally enabled services. I'd like at this point particularly to thank our hosts from Chinese Taipei for this very timely discussion of an extremely important issue. As APEC economies emerge from the unique challenges of the past few years, APEC economies and decision makers are beginning the process of assessing where we succeeded and where we did not in our efforts to maintain economic prosperity in very challenging times. A key lesson that emerged from the pandemic is that sectors and economies that were prepared for a sudden shift to a digital environment performed much better. In this panel, we're going to hear from a number of key public sector voices about the necessary regulatory framework for digital success in some key sectors. And I think the lessons we learn from those key sectors can really be applied across the board to many other services sectors. So although our friends in Chinese Taipei have selected certain sectors to focus on, I think the lessons that we draw from those really can be applied much more broadly. And I'm looking forward to a discussion in the future of other sectors and how the digitally the digital environment and strong regulatory framework for that digital environment can be applied to other sectors. But you all did not sign up to hear from me. You signed up to hear from these excellent speakers we have. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roy-Chan Lee. Dr. Lee is currently the Senior Deputy Executive Director of the WTO and RTA Center at Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research. Dr. Lee specialized in trade liberalization policy, WTO, services trade, TBT and SBS measures, and regional integration. He is policy advisor for trade policy and negotiations and serves as the capital-based expert for WTO and APEC meetings since 2012. And I can say that all of us in the APEC Group on Services are very familiar with Dr. Lee's work and very much look forward to hearing what he has to say today. Dr. Lee?
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your kind introduction, and thank you for chairing this inception session on today's dialogue. Let me start with sharing the slides. Okay, can you? Okay, just for the sake of time, can the organizer share my slides on my for me from your end, please? I don't think I can work. It's working from this end. Is that possible? Just check.
Yes, we are sharing the slide.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Thank you. It's always to buy a kind of insurance by sending the PowerPoints to the organizers. And today, I think I'm done a good thing before this seminar. Okay, thank you very much. I'll spend the next 9 minutes to share with you the summary of the APEC-wide survey results on the 4 focused sectors. Next slide, please. Well, we prepared this survey, APEC-wide survey, to provide an informed discussion for today's PPT. As Thomas mentioned, because of the time constraint and other limitations, we focused the survey on 4 sectors that are most likely to being able to receive the benefits of digitalization, especially during the pandemic. So the 4 focus sectors are healthcare, education, financial, that includes both banking and insurance, and the public services. During the design of the survey, we divide the questions into different time phases. So we ask the questions on the digitalization facilitation measures introduced before the pandemic, and more specifically during the pandemic, and the plans or the realities post-pandemic. I agreed. I understand that many economies have questions on whether we are now officially post-pandemic, but it is a question that's being answered actually by most of the responding economies. So the objective, as I mentioned, is to underpin the informed discussion during today's public-private dialogue. And the reporting time of my presentation is on the 23rd of June 2022, and I have to share with you that we continue to receive survey results after the reporting date. So we will incorporate those informations, additional data provided to us by APEC economists post the reporting day into our completion report. And I take this opportunity to express our gratitude to all the 17 APEC economists who have participated in this survey. Next slide. So to provide a general picture, a snapshot of the situation, it is we actually reflect the frequency of measures adopted by APEC economies to enhance the digitalization of the 4 focused sectors before, during, and post-pandemic. So this is a frequency summary. That means we actually summarize the number of APEC economies and the number of measures introduced by APEC economies on these 4 focus sectors. As you can see from this slide, public services is obviously the most important sector that's receiving facilitations to elevate the level of digitalization. That is, public services provided through digital means, especially during the pandemic. And also, education sector is the next sector that probably the number of measures introduced is almost the same level of as healthcare sectors during the pandemic. For financial sectors, digitalization facilitations are already in place before the pandemic, and during the pandemic, there were equal number of measures introduced to facilitate the digitalization, but the kind of growth rate is not as significant as public service and education sectors. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at the distribution of measures by time sequence, during the pandemic, which is denoted by D, the capital letter D, we actually counted 178 measures that's been reported by APEC economy during the survey that indicates those measures were introduced during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the number of measures is 112, and post-pandemic is 49. So as you can see from the numbers here, there's already a challenge to sustain the momentum that we observed during the pandemic in terms of facilitate the digitalization of the four focus sectors. Next slide, please. If we look at the from a different perspective, that is cross economy comparison, we can see here that the number of APEC economies that have introduced new measures is very much focused on education and public services, especially for education and healthcare services. Especially for education services, the number of new measures introduced during the pandemic is much more significant than other sectors. I think we have all experienced the constraints and limitations during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think this reflects our real life experiences in terms of different economies introducing remote education modes to continue the education during the pandemic, and that is reflected here in the number of measures introduced. Next slide, please. And we also asked this question in the survey: is the measures introduced during the pandemic temporal, that is, measures contingent to address specific spatial needs and conditions during the pandemic, or they are introduced on a permanent basis, that is, they are not going to be cancelled or withdrawn after post the pandemic. As you can see here, for healthcare and the education sectors, the number of measures that are considered temporal is almost equal to the number of measures that are considered permanent. Whereas for the public sector and for the financial services sector, most measures, there are more measures considered permanent than temporal. So this is something that kind of surprised us, because before the survey, we thought that most of the measures will be considered contingent, but it turns out at the end of the survey that many of the measures introduced are actually permanent. That is, they will stay in place post pandemic. Next slide, please. And we again ask more detailed questions on whether there are plans to convert temporal measures introduced during the pandemic into permanent measures post-pandemic. Again, it is interesting to find out that for most of the measures introduced during the pandemic for education and public services, there are currently no plan to convert into permanent measures, but there are a number of measures that are still temporary in nature, are subject to future plans that will be stay in place post the pandemic. Next slide, please. So finally, there are at least three key findings that I would like to share with you today in this PPT. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic is certainly a policy accelerator, accelerator to move to kind of push governments across the APEC region to introduce new measures to digitalize the full focused sectors. The number of new measures introduced during the pandemic stands at 178, and that is significantly higher than measures introduced before the pandemic. And public and education services sectors are the main recipients of these new digitalization measures. Most measures introduced are permanent rather than contingent, as already discussed. So the fact that most of the measures are introduced on a permanent basis reflect the facts that it is for most of the APEC economies, governments capture the opportunity provided by the pandemic to increase or accelerate the reform efforts by both improving or extending existing measures that allow digitalized services provisions, and also by introducing new measures to elevate the level of digitalization for the full focused sectors. So the final challenge, as already mentioned, is how can we sustain the reform momentum post-pandemic. The number of measures introduced or planned to introduce post-pandemic has dropped, reduced significantly vis-a-vis the number of new measures introduced during the pandemic. Before today's event, there's a pre-event expert panel discussion organized by Chinese Taipei Services Coalition, and the recommendations provided by the experts during the discussion are as follows. First one, the experts encourage APEC economies or APEC to take stock of regional common practices during the pandemic. They understand there is a divergence between different APEC economies in terms of these facilitations to these four focus sectors. And also they encourage us to exchange experiences on, for example, the user uptake rate. That is, how many users are using these new digitalized services provisions, and what's the limitations that prevents users to uptake those new services, digitalized services. And secondly, experiences on impact on the quality of services once they convert into digitally provided mode, and also the impact on regulatory practices and all the regulators' reaction to those experiences those measures introduced during the pandemic. So the final finding is that yes, we are seeing acceleration of new measures to enable digitalization of the full focus sectors, but they were the biggest question is how can we maintain the momentum post pandemic? And I will stop here. Thank you very much. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That was really fascinating presentation of the results of that survey. I'm kind of amazed at the number of measures that are foreseen to be permanent coming out of the pandemic, and I think that's very encouraging that members seem to have become quite comfortable with some of these new measures they're putting in place. Our next speaker is from our APEC host this year, Thailand. Our speaker is Prupray Chumrum, who is the executive director of the Bureau of Trade and Services and Investment Negotiations in the Department of Trade Negotiations within the Ministry of Commerce of Thailand, and has been in that position since early 2018. Ms. Chumrum is was previously engaged in bilateral affairs in Asia, the Middle East, and African regions, as well as multilateral negotiations in the WTO for more than 20 years. Prupray has had various working background and experiences on international economics, international relations, including negotiations on goods, services, investment, environment, climate change, and many other issues at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels. So we're looking forward to hearing the perspective of our Thai hosts. So Ms. Chumram, may I turn the floor over to you? Prupre?
Thank you, Tom. Very good morning and good evening to all APEC colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank Chinese Taipei to host interesting sessions. And I think it's a very timely discussion since the COVID-19 is still around. And actually, I think we see the increase of the digital business playing more and more important roles in the economic developments, across the world. And I have to thank Dr. Lee for providing the very informative background on the survey. I think which is have a linkage with my presentations as well. Let me share slides a bit. Okay, everyone can see, right? So actually for the education services, I have to say that education services, I think for all economies are critical importance regarding, like fostering personal social developments as well as economic development in our economy. They're the key driver for the innovative growth, improved level of educations are also the key of raising sustainable rate of economic growth and general economic and social economic well-being of economy. But the situations during the COVID-19 for education services in particular, of course, I think the measures, like for the safety of the students, not for the students, but for all people, traveling restrictions, we have to, like keep social distancing. So actually all the schools have to be closed. So the digital technologies, like play an important roles in keep on going with the educations, because the students, when we're talking about education, it's not just, okay, you can have a work from home, educations from home, and then you can using your laptops, internet, but actually we have to take care of all students, including those who are in vulnerable situations, like in a remote area. And actually not all of them, can access to the infrastructure. Not all of them have equipment, electronic gadgets at home. So actually that's quite challenging, including in Thailand. To cope with all these challenges, I think its ability to adjust, how to ensure that the education's opportunities is for all. In order to cope with these challenges, Thailand, I think we're using a lot of varieties of the educational technologies, including the distance learning program to reach out the marginalized groups and bridge the divide between urban and rural areas. To use technologies, I have to say that the Ministry of Education of Thailand provides 5 learning methods to support education resumptions in each regions of the country. There's 5 of them, like on-site educations. This is appropriate for the school. I think we still have very few that a number of students are allowed for the safe social distancing that, of course, the masses requires, and that the situations at this moment. We are also on-air educations from home, where they can learn from home through the satellites and the distance learning television program. We have like online education through electronic applications. We have online on-demand learning, which is that is also through the electronic application system. We have also on-hand teacher. When I mentioned about remote areas, actually not all of us, not all students in Thailand can access to the internet, or they can have like a mobile to access to the applications. So actually the teachers, some region, they have to go to the student's home and provide a books, or this is the on-site, we call on-site or on-hand education. That's still ongoing. I have to say that to create a style environment, when we're talking about style environment for digital enabled services, it's all about the transformations. And I think Thomas already pointed out, and also Dr. Lee said that technologies or pandemics also is accelerator for the digital disruptions. When we talk about how we adjust, we have to think about the ICT infrastructure. Actually, in Thailand, the ICT infrastructure has been integrated into the teaching and learning to enable all our learners to use utilize the digital technology and obtain relevant skills and competence required in this digital age. I wouldn't say that only students. Actually, when we talk about education, also including me, like when we have to reskill, upskill for the government officials, all the virtuals or online courses also very important. Currently, the effort is being taken nationally to transform to the blended learning model, which includes a digital learning platform for students that they can practice and learn skills required in their daily lives. In relation to this, the student nationwide will be provided with opportunities to access to the nationwide, access to the wide range of the learning resources online. Teachers also are being supported by giving them access to different technologies and training and how to use these new technologies. So we are talking also about the digital literacy. It's not easy, not all of them. The teacher not really equipped with the digital skill earlier, but as pandemic is accelerator, I think all of them have to, catch up quickly with these skills, and because the teacher will be a key driver to the students as well. Thailand exerted our best effort ensuring the inclusive access of to the educations. There were challenges to our actual implementations, like as I give examples, like remote areas. Actually, the access to the telecommunications infrastructure, internet access, learning software, or even computer equipment or smartphone, like support online educations remain quite limited in a remote area. Educators and students in remote areas also require extra training how to use those systems, effectively. And I have to thank, actually in Thailand, I think we have some collaborations with the key multinational corporations as well, like Microsoft or even Google, regarding how to cope with all this, the training. The Ministry of Education also made use of the big data, I would say, to support the education officials and schools to be able to obtain the overall pictures of the Thai education. So actually they can also analyze appropriately the efforts being made to enhance the digital-based management educations in all areas. Actually, when we're talking about the Ministry of Education, actually in Thailand, we have a law govern the educations in general. We call it the National Education Act. Actually, that's the key law governing. But actually, there's many laws that we have to enact, to make it operationalized. Actually, the key issue just for the student safety, adults, educator, vocational trainings, lifelong learnings, and actually one factor that we have to give into account enacting following laws that how to improve the efficiencies for the online educations. So actually, when Dr. Lee mentions about the measures that it seems temporary, but actually it's probably turned to the permanent one, I think Thailand is looking at these kind of factors quite seriously. So actually, we will take into account some measures, because actually the online education will provide like alternative choice for the students or educators as well. But when we talk about how back to the educations, we adopted to support the students to return to education. Actually, there are 3 key programs that we introduced recently. The first one is to bring the kids back to school. Actually, have been the whole on-site classes under the COVID-19 safety protocol, whereby the student and teachers must test themselves to prevent the virus from spreading. The project targets students who have dropped off from school with a goal of 0 enrolled students. For on-site portions of classes, active learning is promoted to boost student knowledge and social skills. Students must learn new and specific skills for tomorrow workers, which will require and learn continually to adapt to the new occupations emerge. The learners will receive a comprehensive whole person development to fulfill their potentials and help to shape their future. Thailand is also highlighting the promotions of quality school to mobilize school resources and raise the quality of the learning nationwide. The second program we call the Ministry of Education Safety Center. Actually, the Safety Center is provide like online channel to keep like strict, tighten security and surveillance at school. Actually, under this scheme is quite interesting one. I think the Ministry of Education has developed a number of measures on human-to-human violence, accidents preventions, like general violations of rights, mental and physical health hazards to promote the safety of the students and the educational personnel in school. So actually, to drive this project forward, we use like safety center applications, the website, or even the live applications or like call center to help all these measures taken in an efficient way. The third program is a free boarding TVET. This program aims to include the disadvantages to the education system for those who have to leave school after graduating or like lower secondary educations in remote area. The goal is to provide a group of students with necessary skills after completing the TVET college, like technical vocational educations. Selected college are equipped with the necessary facility to enhance cognitive skill, critical thinking, actually to have more learning environment to be adjusted to promote learning abilities of students. This college provide not only the tuition fee free of charge, but also boarding and lodging for the students. Students will be able to expose to the life skills since we spend most of time with their peers. Actually, in summary, I think Thailand has made a conscious effort to overcome challenges imposed by the COVID pandemic, just to ensure, I think the ultimate goal is to ensure that all the educators and learners have equal opportunities to access to the education through the adoptions of digital services that the government providing. But from the international trade perspective, I would say that Thailand is well aware that the importance of online services, including the educational services, and also we are aware of the recent challenge of the quicken of the need to access to the online learning system. In other words, we call it mode one, delivery on education services, online or distant education, expand the access available to the wider range of educations and training opportunities, and definitely can help to lower cost of obtaining the requisites of educational qualification as well. Today, I think there are many courses available to study abroad from international institutes, and that can be also accessed from, like cross-border services. Meanwhile, the educator, especially those from the private sector, we need to develop a wide range of online courses that will cater to today's world as it becomes smaller with the technology. But in this regard, the most important issue is to ensure that education goes on. And of course, we're talking about the quality as well. So actually, when we talk about the quality of the such online program or the online course from Thailand and abroad, how to make sure. So actually, the mutual recognized quality assurance or standard is also playing important part on this. A robust and transparency quality assurance will be also important to helping the graduate gain employment in the competitive market. To promote such development, including the MIA, Thailand is participating in various schemes, including ASEAN. And actually, recently, we also have some FTA talking about the cooperations on education services. When we talk about ASEAN, I think there are many programs like referencing national qualifications framework, ASEAN qualifications reference frameworks, which also aim to develop comparable standards among ASEAN member states to facilitate the movement of workforce in the region, which is the ultimate goal of ASEAN, movement of people. In addition, recent development of initiatives also include ASEAN in the technicals and vocational educations and training, TVET, which is intended to equip all ASEAN workforce with the competencies and skill that align with the market demand and integrate the young people, young workforce into the labor market, of course, with a demand-driven one. So actually, I think that's all from our perspective, and I think that's very important to have ASEAN to address labor shortage in ASEAN also happened as a consequence of the career change in many workers to return upskill, reskills, and also giving opportunities for them to come back to work, back to the educations after the COVID pandemic. I mean, of course, it probably is never ending, COVID, but we keep it on, and we hopefully that that's all the measures taken will bring some benefits to all of the students and educators, not only just in Thailand, but in the regions and of course in the APEC as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prue, for that very interesting presentation on the importance of education to a growing economy like Thailand, and how you maintained it during these challenging times of the pandemic. I particularly want to echo your salute to the teachers whose dedication was really key to driving forward the adjustment to a digital environment. So that was very, very interesting and very timely for us. Trying to keep to our schedule that our hosts have set for us, I'd like to promptly turn over to our next speaker, Janos Ferenc from he's a trade policy analyst with the OECD Services Division. He really needs no introduction in a GOS dialogue. He's been a frequent contributor to the APEC Group on Services discussion of measuring barriers to trade and services, and has appeared at numerous APEC workshops and dialogues. So let me turn it over to Janos, please.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to start by thanking Chinese Taipei for the invitation, and also to congratulate Dr. Lee for the very informative survey. So without any further ado, let me share a very brief presentation. And let me start by just echoing a little bit the key theme of this session, which is to talk about enabling regulatory environments for digitally deliverable services in healthcare, financial services, and so on, which is a very important question in light of rapid technological developments and in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So my contribution to the conversation today will be to provide the OECD's perspective on this issue and focus on the importance of open digital trade regulations. Services trade has grown faster in the Asia and Pacific region than in any other parts of the globe in recent years. If we look between 2005 and 2020, the total annual services trade in the region increased by 6% on average, which is well above the global average of 4.5%. And if we zoom in on digitally deliverable services, we see the increasing share of this in the total services trade. And what we see particularly is that the average growth in digitally deliverable services has been about 9% annually, which is again much above the global average of 7%. So in the region, in the APEC region, has been 9% compared to the global average of 7%. So there is clearly a potential for digitally deliverable services in the APEC region. And if we look a bit at the role of digitalization in transforming services, perhaps 6 key trends or transformative factors can be identified. Firstly, digitalization has enabled a new means of delivering services across borders, and particularly what we heard before in terms of education has been one of the leading ways through which services can now be more easily provided across borders. And digitalization also eased the tradability of more traditional services that previously were considered more difficult to be traded across borders. Very importantly, the growing presence of data and the availability of tracking and collecting data has enabled the rise of an information industry that builds on collecting, processing, and generating value out of data. The fourth point is also the growing bundling between goods and services. And here, again, a good example is perhaps a mobile phone, which by itself would mean very little if it would not have services and applications that generate value for the users. It's also important to mention services that enable digital trade, such as telecommunications, financial services, transport and logistics services, which operate in the background and form the pillar of any digital activity that takes place on top of the internet. So it's a very important network of services that enable digital activities. And lastly, it's also important to take note of emerging technologies such as 3D printing or artificial intelligence that push the boundaries of new services and have the potential to generate more productivity gains along the production chains. But transformation of services activities is not only dependent on new technology, but also requires an enabling regulatory environment for businesses and an environment that also promotes trust and security for consumers. So regulation plays a very important role in facilitating digital growth. And at the same time, what we have seen in recent years has been also that regulations on digital services has become more complex. And particularly this is due to the fact that many of services regulation by nature take place behind the border. So they are a bit more challenging to understand and to map. So I would like to provide a few key insights based on the OECD's work on measuring and monitoring the regulatory environment for digital trade. And let me start by providing you with a broad overview of what we see across the globe and what we see particularly in the APEC region. So firstly, barriers to digital trade are high across the world as we measure it through the OECD Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And while on average the APEC region performs better than the global average, there is considerable heterogeneity across economies, which can create further obstacles for businesses trading in the region. Importantly also, over the course of the past years, the number of barriers to digital services trade has been rising, both globally as well as in the APEC region. But what drives this restrictiveness and what differences can we observe across regions? And recently we have done some new data collection for economies in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and also some expansion to other economies in the Asia Pacific. And this gave us a bit more insights into how different regions compare to each other. And I just want to show you some of these findings. What you can see here is that barriers related to communication infrastructure and connectivity contribute at least half of all barriers observed in the regions that we looked at. And this demonstrates scope for reducing barriers related to telecommunication services, but also scope to maybe ease unnecessary and unjustified barriers to cross-border data flows. Looking at computer services, which are fundamental to digital trade, there are also considerable scope to reduce barriers, particularly with respect to investment regulation and barriers that affect the movement of computer professionals. And why should we aim to lower barriers to digital trade, and why should we aim to create interoperable regulatory frameworks? The evidence shows that lowering restrictiveness to digital trade, as we measure it through the STRI tools, is associated with increased trade in digitally enabled services, higher access to and use of communication networks. So easing barriers on digital markets can help to lower trade costs for businesses, increase competitiveness, and lower prices for consumers. And importantly also, there are some concrete gains from easing regulatory hurdles. For instance, implementing best regulatory practices on services domestic regulations in areas such as licensing or authorization procedures, and adhering to the WTO reference paper on services domestic regulations could bring sizable benefits across digitally intensive services. For instance, annual savings for financial services could amount up to $50 billion US, 40 billion in business services, and 25 billion in communication services. So these are very, very important gains for companies, but also for consumers, because they would benefit from lower prices on digital services. And let me conclude by raising 3 points that I think are particularly relevant. The first one is the importance of strengthening the evidence base which informs policy discussions. And I think through the different work streams and the work of different organizations, we are building up this evidence base that helps to inform discussions in APEC, at the WTO, and elsewhere. The second point is to acknowledge that the existing evidence points to the fact that barriers on digital trade remain high and have been increasing in recent years. And again, this highlights the importance of closer cooperation among economies, both regionally and internationally, in order to enable this regulatory environment that facilitates digitally enabled services. And I think APEC plays a very important role in this regard, and has been playing a very important role historically if we think about policy principles, for instance, around cross-border privacy regulation. The APEC region as such has been providing very important opportunities for sharing experiences and best practices on these issues. So let me conclude by highlighting an upcoming publication for those who are interested in learning a bit more about our work. We are launching a new publication tomorrow that provides more insights on some of the regional regulatory environment in digital services. So with that, thank you very much for the attention, and back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Janos. Thank you for that introduction to the new information that's available to economies to inform their policy discussions and to help us all aim our efforts to open trade, and also to previewing the publication that I think we're all looking forward to turning to tomorrow. Our next speaker is Toshihiko Isawa, who's the Director for International Cooperation at the Secretariat of Personal Information Protection Commission, and has been since July of 2021. His main responsibility is to develop international strategies for PPC Japan and to strengthen cooperative relationships with data protection and privacy authorities in other economies. Before joining PPC Japan, he was the Director for Intelligence at the Customs Tariff Bureau of the Ministry of Finance of Japan. And he has been involved in various projects throughout his career, including negotiations on economic partnership agreements and bilateral customs agreements. So with that introduction, Mr. Isawa, may I turn the floor over to you, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I hope that you can hear my voice, and I want to share my slide. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to join this meeting. Today, I would like to explain the global strategies of the Personal Information Protection Commission of Japan. Next slide, please. Thank you. The PPC Japan published the global strategy in the end of March this year. So it is the first time for us to develop such comprehensive strategy for our international activities. Before explaining the content of our strategies, I want to describe why we have developed these strategies this year. The first reason is the growth of the data flow. Because of the growth of the data flow, as well as the advancement of the information communication technology, the importance of smooth cross-border transfer of the data including the personal information, is increasing over the year. Under this circumstance, the government of Japan has advocated data free flow with trust, called DFFT, in 2019 of the G20 Osaka Summit. The second reason is the development of our legal framework. From this April, the revised APPI, Act on the Protection of the Personal Information, came into effect. Before the revision of this, our national registration APPI, the coverage of our surveillance authorities is limited to the public sectors only. However, the revised APPI give us the full coverage authorities. It means that now the PPC Japan's may manage or supervise not only private sectors, but also the public sectors. And another reason is that, I did not show it on the slide, but the Japan will host the G7 meeting in next year. And in the area of the personal information protection, we have the G7 roundtable meeting. All chairpersons of the Data Protection Authority and Privacy Authorities will join this roundtable. And the next G7 roundtable will be hosted by the Germany in September, but the Japanese PPC will host the G7 roundtable next year. So that's why we needed the sort of the global strategies to make the G7 meeting or other international forum meetings more fruitful. And based on this background that we have the strategies, there are three pillars. As you can see, that the development of the environment for DFFT, appropriate response to emerging trend, and further strengthening of the international cooperation for enforcement. Next slide, please. Let me explain the first pillar of our strategies. It is a development of the favorable environment for DFFT. And it is possible to divide it into three different actions. The first action is the PPC will create an environment where business can choose cross-border transfer scheme from multiple options. Normally, that the business operator cannot send the personal data to third countries without the clear approval from the data subject. However, if they have the appropriate framework, the safeguard measures to protect the personal information, they are able to transfer the data to third countries. And regarding the transfer schemes, normally there are several options such as adequacy decisions, certification scheme, or simply having the contract between the exporters and the importers of the data to ensure appropriate safeguard measures on the personal data. And our understanding that we do not have to push a particular framework, but we have to prepare the several options, because normally the business operator want to choose one particular scheme from multiple options based on their business scale or business needs, so that we consider that the availability of the multiple options is a very important element to encourage the data transfers of the business operators. The next action is the expansion of the data transfer framework. Japan has a mutual adequacy framework with the EU and the UK, so that in theory that the exchange of the personal data between EU and Japan and the UK is free. That you are able to exchange the personal data with those countries. So the PPC Japan will maintain and development of those frameworks, and consider the possibility to expand the scope. The third one is that the PPC will contribute the formation of the global standard on emerging risks, such as the unlimited government access and data localization. Now we have the series of the discussion at the OECD in those areas. Next slide, please. The second pillar is to understand and respond to the emerging trend. In order to respond to the rapid progress of the information and communication technologies and the associated issues on the personal data protection, the PPC Japan will analyze the global trend on technological innovation. There are a lot of new topics for technological development and relationship with the personal data protection. For instance, we have discussed the online tracking, called cookies, issues, the facial recognition cameras, AI, and of course the COVID-19 or healthcare issues that normally the healthcare information is very sensitive personal information, so that we have to pay the special attention to those areas. And another recent issue is the privacy enhancing technology, so that at different forums, not only the APEC, but also the GPA, APPA. GPA is a global privacy assembly, so that it's a very unique international forum for the privacy issues. So we discuss those emerging trends at the international framework. Furthermore, the PPC will make the collected information publicly available, of course, for policy making as well as for the business operators to operate their business smoothly. Next slide, please. The third pillar is the international cooperation for enforcement. The number of the violation cases of the personal information that involve several countries and cannot be handled only by one country is expected to increase. Of course, you can imagine that now that some IT giants, if they violate the personal information, it's not the issue of the one countries, but also the several countries. Therefore, it is very natural that we have to cooperate each other with the other personal information data authorities in other countries. At this moment, for instance, the PPC Japan have started the discussion to conclude the bilateral MOU with other DPA, the data protection authorities. And Japan is now the host, the G7 working group of the International Enforcement Cooperation, and now we have the discussion on how we strengthen our mutual or multilateral cooperations for effective enforcement action to protect the personal information. So, that this is the end of my presentation. But I think I just explained that the global strategies of the PPC Japan. However, I can say that the other DPA, the Data Protection and Privacy Authority, has a similar approach. We always discuss about how we implement the DFFT, how to encourage the business operator to transfer the data with the appropriate safeguard on the personal data. And also that we have the several working groups to discuss about the emerging technologies such as the online tracking, facial recognition cameras, and of course the international cooperation for enforcement is always a hot topic among us. So thank you very much for your listening. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Osawa. That was very interesting and very informative. It's important to remember, I think, as you're emphasizing to us, that digital trade can only grow if we have a good understanding of the privacy implications for this growth. And also, I very much appreciated your emphasis on the importance of cooperation in building trust on these privacy issues. Our next speaker, actually, before I get to our next speaker, let me just call everybody's attention to the fact that there are some good questions being posted in the chat box. We're trying to keep to our schedule, so I'm going to move on to the next speaker, but I think it'll benefit everybody to take a look at some of the questions that are being posted there. Our next speaker is Deborah Young, who's the founding CEO of the RegTech Association, a community of more than 120 organizations who collaborate, educate, and have groundbreaking conversations. And I hope during the presentation we'll learn more about the RegTech Association. Excuse me. Deborah has more than 20 years of experience in financial services advocacy and engagement across technology, venture capital, private equity, financial markets, insurance, and superannuation. Deborah is a finalist in the 2019 CEO of the Year Awards by the Women in Finance and has an executive MBA from the UTS Business School. So we're very fortunate to have her addressing this public-private dialogue today. Deborah, may I turn the floor over to you?
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for Chinese Taipei and the APEC economies for having me here today. I thought I would start by just briefly restating the objective today, and then I'm going to try and keep to my 10-minute time slot. So my understanding is the objective of today is for us to come together to discuss the measures and policies to promote the development of digitally enabled services in the context of the pandemic, and to make some suggestions and to introduce some future reform plans. Thank you very much for having me here today. I thought a good place for us to start might be a little bit about my organisation, in case you're not aware. So we are a non-profit industry association. We were founded in 2017. We are a small team. We have 10 directors, and we have 170 organisations that are part of our community. We lead engagement and collaboration between regulators, institutions, governments, and technology companies. And we run programs, events, research. We do consulting work, and we work very closely with trade agencies. We've recently been part of founding a new technology collective of 7 different trade organisations in the tech sector. And we have 4 active MOUs in place with associations from APEC economies. Late last year, we helped facilitate a project for APEC, and this report that you can see on the screen was the result of that work. And this report, if you're interested, is obviously freely available on the APEC website. And it sought to make a series of recommendations on how both FinTech and RegTech could play a really important and significant role in assisting in a post-pandemic environment. And many of these recommendations still stand true today. And they were around a series of themed clusters of regulation, innovation, collaboration, and education. We developed a concept paper, and we developed and rolled out a series of global webinars attended by APEC economies around the key areas, and this paper was the result. But actually, probably more importantly, there were some recommendations that were made, and I just want to recap on some of those primary recommendations because I think it touches on some of the things that we've been covering this morning. We want to see, a fostering of closer collaboration between regulators globally, that regulators and policymakers are creating streamlined paths to market for innovators, to encourage more funding to support innovation and incubation, and that is both from a policy perspective, but also getting funding to the actual innovators themselves, but also funding from governments flowing through to industry where it's required. adopting a recognised global typology for both RegTech and FinTech, to create a community of interest groups for regulators and policymakers, foster peer-to-peer learning and sharing of regulatory best practices through such initiatives as GFIT, OSCO and the many others, including some interesting work by Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, who've just created a soup check lab. And acknowledging the role that RegTech plays in supporting growth and development of a trusted digital financial ecosystem. There's also a strong emergence and a recognition that governments play more than just a significant policy-making role, but also can be a buyer and consumer and influence of RegTech. And when we think that the global RegTech spend is predicted to be $204 billion by 2026, this is a real opportunity. And I hope to unpack that a little bit more and to underline what I've just said in relation to government as a buyer. There was a recent article, and I've taken an excerpt from that article that said, the global pandemic has impressed upon us the benefit of and the urgent need for digital technologies and solutions among citizens, businesses and governments alike across Asia-Pac. Even as the worst days of the pandemic restrictions and lockdowns are behind us, e-government initiatives will remain a significant element of an economy's digitalisation journey. And we could not agree more with these sentiments, and certainly echo those that were mentioned earlier by Dr. Lee. We are seeing use cases of government applying RegTech in such things as family and community safety, sharing of sensitive data and information between government agencies, rolling out local government initiatives to streamline citizen interactions and better quality of life, digitisation of services to citizens through improved digital identity. And with government as a buyer and influencer, this provides RegTechs with a serious pathway to scale and governments being able to actively foster economic recovery while improving access to innovation. Now, the point of me showing you this quick slide is that 4 out of these 5 top RegTech powerhouses are APEC economies. And so I think it's high time that we recognise this as a strength, not just in financial services, but across all regulated industries. Recently, we did some of our own research, and I just wanted to take a quick walk through some high points of that research. And that is that the RegTech industry remained very, very resilient throughout the pandemic. That the RegTech industry is creating jobs around the world right now. There is more sophisticated investment flowing in to RegTech across different investment horizons. 2/3 of the RegTechs in our community reported strong revenue growth from the FY20 to 21. The time to value metrics has shortened, and what that actually means is the time taken from a first conversation with a regulator or an institution by a technology company has shortened by 23% since 2019, which suggests that the solutions are getting to market faster, but there's more work to do. RegTechs did report barriers, but are now experiencing unexpected new opportunities to export their solutions post-pandemic. And we are seeing more and quicker scale full production deployments over the last 12 months. And really quickly, I wanted to share with you a few things on the buy side and the sell side. So on the sell side, we are seeing that there's a growth in jobs. There are new opportunities emerging, but the greatest challenge for all small technology companies is the barrier, is procurement as a key barrier. So that's something we need to continue to work on. And from the buy side, we're seeing a stronger commitment to buy rather than build their own solutions. There's new industries emerging, insurance, healthcare, telco, plus we will see energy and government join that. The key drivers for institutions are regulatory pressure, digital transformation, and the cost of compliance is increasing. This slide shows our own association's goal over the next 12 months, and I thought it was worthwhile sharing this with the APEC audience because we have a real commitment to enhancing our global regulatory engagement, looking to grow our tech our tech alliances around the world to educate and promote RegTech more widely. Our members have indicated that there is a key APEC economy that's a key market for them, and we'll be looking to enhance our economic and trade relationships to support that. 3 new industry areas that we will have some focus on is government, as I've just mentioned, the small to medium enterprises that can benefit from RegTech adoption, and the second-tier financial services players. And last and certainly not least, we want to be embracing and adopting ESG, environmental, social and governance principles, as an industry to better support the fragile natural environment and the resources, as well as deliver inclusive services done well in an ethical and trusted manner, and to enhance our investor outreach and also to enhance our research capabilities on not only our own research initiatives but via partnerships. So to summarise, we want to foster and fund initiatives that help governments and regulators revolutionise and transform the norm with a digital-first mindset, using the strengths of the collaborative nature of the APEC economies to bring about some of this change, to give deeper consideration that RegTech serves all regulated industries, including financial services, fintech, government, and many other industries besides, recognising that as a collective of APEC economies, you are sitting on a collective powerhouse of RegTech innovation already, and our association looks forward to serving APEC in the future on initiatives that can help us deliver to the goals of the ATRL Plan of Action, to support the Leaders Declaration, as well as the Services Competitiveness Roadmap. And final slide is just to say thank you very much for this opportunity. Please do reach out either by email, via our website, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, and hopefully I didn't go over time. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Deborah. No, I think that was a very important message as economies in APEC are beginning to take away some of the lessons that we've learned from the other speakers. It's important to know that there are resources available out there for governments who may need help sorting through the issues and identifying what their priorities should be. And so the existence of your organization is really quite key for many APEC economies, and we look forward to continuing to work with RegTech Association in the future.
Thank you.
We're running a bit behind time, but I'd like to introduce our last speaker, who I understand will be appearing by pre-recorded presentation. Dr. Martin Roy is a counselor in the Trade and Services and Investment Division of the World Trade Organization. And he's been with the WTO since 2002, is well known to many of us. He's been involved in various functions relating to negotiations, technical assistance, dispute settlement, and policy research. Between 2014 and 2016, he was senior advisor at the Office of the Chief Trade Advisor for Pacific Island countries, and he has advised in that role 14 developing countries in the region. Dr. Roy has published widely on such topics as trade and services, foreign investment, and regional economic integration. He's also co-edited the research handbook on trade and services published in 2016, and also Opening Markets for Trade and Services published in 2008. Dr. Roy has taught at the College of Europe in Bruges, the University of Barcelona, and the World Trade Institute in Bern. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over virtually to Dr. Roy for his presentation.
Well, good day. Good day to everybody. My name is Martin Roy. I work in the WTO Secretariat in the Trade and Services Division. Thank you for inviting me to take part today. The theme of this session is to focus on the policy environment for digitally enabled services. What I want to do in this presentation is to focus on those services that are key enablers for digital services trade, namely ICT services, specifically telecom and computer services. These digitally enabling services are essential for the growth of digital services trade. And I also want to highlight the role of services trade policy and trade rules and binding commitments in relation to these sectors, which I think are key to the overall policy environment. Now, let me try to share some slides with you. I think that a key channel through which digitization has transformed trade is through the impact and development of those ICT services, so computer and telecom, that provide the basic infrastructure through which electronic supply and transactions take place. Technological improvements and also policies of governments over time to facilitate investment and competition have increased the capacity of the telecom network to carry more data, more content at higher speed and lower prices. And this has really expanded the tradability of services, enabling cross-border supply across a wide array of services, so those digitally enabled services. This was also reflected in greater Mode 1 supply, greater Mode 1 trade overall, and greater data flows, which are enabled and facilitated by the operations of these telecom and computer services suppliers, such as data processing, data storage services. Now, this shift towards a digital economy and digital services has been accelerated, as is well understood now, by the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has encouraged suppliers to expand their online operations. Consumers have developed new habits, and this can contribute to a long-term shift towards online services and to, over time, greater trade on their services Mode 1 with digital services. Now, this was made possible by the performance of ICT networks and applications, which have sustained and enabled demand not only for telework and teleeducation, but also telemedicine, retail, food deliveries, contactless payments, and so on. And the quality of these infrastructure services really made a very significant difference. Now, it's important to recognize that digitization has impacted trade, but that trade and trade policy has also impacted digitization and will continue to do so. And in particular, services trade policy is a key part of the overall policy environment. And services trade policy essentially means market access measures, national treatment measures, and other key measures affecting trade and services under whether cross-border supply or investment or commercial presence. Research over the last decade have shown the impact of services trade policies, showing that sectors facing lower services trade barriers tend to have higher productivity growth than those with higher barriers and higher trade costs. Services trade restrictions have a negative impact on foreign investment flows. And also trade barriers, maybe more directly, exacerbate the digital divide. Trade barriers in telecommunication services, especially with higher levels of services trade restrictiveness in those sectors being associated with lower penetration for fixed mobile and broadband internet. So, and this in turn has very significant impact on all those services that need to use the internet and the telecom infrastructure to provide services. Now, barriers may be lower in telecommunication than some other services sectors overall, but there's still a number of barriers in place, typically competition-related measures or quantitative restrictions, and more so with respect to developing countries. Now, what can the WTO contribute with respect to these enabling services for the digital economy? Well, the first contribution would be to first encourage lower barriers to trade and to investment with respect to these services, to provide also importantly for greater predictability, that is to prevent the introduction of new barriers, to prevent protectionist policy reversals, also to ensure greater transparency with respect to these key trade measures that can affect investment and trade in telecommunications, and to encourage best practices in relation to measures affecting trade. And this in turn can provide very significant benefits for all the users, all the different services that are provided through this infrastructure. Now, if we look at the current existing rules or commitments, there are a few that can be highlighted, and those can all be, of course, improved. And the first one is to highlight specific commitments on market access and national treatment. Of course, many WTO members will have undertaken binding commitments with respect to openness, with respect to market access and national treatment in telecom computer services. But still, a good number of members do not have commitments or have left some parts of the sector uncommitted, or some modes of supply uncommitted, or have commitments that do not reflect the current level of trade openness in the sector. Of course, many of these commitments were taken many years ago. In addition to that, an important key tool in the WTO is the reference paper on basic telecommunication services, which purpose is to make effective the market access that is committed in the WTO by having a set of rules of best practices with respect to issues like competition, interconnection, independent regulators, and so on. So a good number of members, more than 100, have taken commitments on that, but still a number of members have not. Another area where discussions are ongoing in the WTO on provisions that are of particular relevance to these digitally enabling services are concerned the negotiations under the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, which is a plurilateral negotiation involving some members, which is open to all, but involves those members that want to take part. Covers a wide range of issues. Good progress has been made on a number of topics with pretty much clean text on a number of obligations. Some issues maybe more closely relate to telecom computer services. Of course, market access is also discussed there, even though negotiations are not taking place as such on this. There's also discussion on how to improve possibly the reference paper on telecommunication services. And then there are two other issues I wanted to highlight. One is discussion of obligations with respect to free data flows or cross-border data flows, which aims to ensure that data can flow across border, subject, of course, to some public policy exceptions, and obligations to prevent data localization requirements. Now, this is maybe more significant types of obligations still being discussed, with some differences of views that still need to be addressed, typically relating to the type of exceptions with respect to some of these principles, and also how this may interact with policies to ensure the protection of personal data. Another obligation which is relevant for telecom computer services, which is being discussed in that context, is what we call open internet access. That is aims to encourage governments to ensure that end users in their territory can or are able to access and use services and applications of their choice on the internet. So in terms of conclusion, what I would want to to highlight is that there are a number of tools in the WTO, in the GATS, also in other ongoing discussions and negotiations that can be useful. The benefit or the value added of the WTO is that it covers, of course, many economies. And these tools can be used to improve transparency, openness, encourage competition, and encourage best practices with respect to these digitally enabling services that are really essential for all these other services to be provided digitally and to be traded in that way. And these policies, these trade policies that affect these digitally enabling services can really make a key contribution to the overall policy environment, aiming to attract investment, promote innovation, and encourage competition. And that, again, in turn, is essential for digital trade more generally. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I hope your discussion goes well today. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. We've heard a very good series of presentations today in this panel, a number of important public perspectives on how to foster digital evolution and promote growth in services as we emerge from the pandemic period. We've heard that from a number of perspectives. It'll be interesting to see how those perspectives tie in to some of the private sector views that we are going to hear in the coming panels. With that, Linda, I apologize for having gone over time, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentation today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fai, for moderating the session for us. And thank you to all the speakers for your very informative presentations. After hearing from the public sector perspective, we will now shift our focus to the private sector perspective. And in particular, we will look into the challenges and opportunities of digitally enabled services. And the moderator for this session is Mr. Anthony Patrick Chua. Mr. Chua is the convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, APSC, which is the world's largest network of services industries and major business associations dedicated to promoting the importance of the services sector in the Asia Pacific region and beyond. Since APSC's launch in 2015, Mr. Chua has been in charge of developing programs, organizing activities, and engaging with stakeholders across different sectors. Mr. Chua is also the Philippines lead staffer in APEC Business Advisory Council and the coordinator of the Philippines Services Coalition. And he has over 15 years of experience in policy research, advocacy, and project management. So without further ado, I will now turn the floor over to our moderator, Mr. Chua. Mr. Chua, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Linda. I hope everyone can hear me. So in the interest of time, in the previous session, we explored how we can create an enabling regulatory environment for digitally enabled services, especially in the areas of health, education, finance, trade in goods and services, as well as data flows. In this session, we will see how the economy and our people can further take advantage of liberalizing digitally enabled services. As we discuss the benefits and challenges, we will try to identify measures that can harness the potential and address the issues therein. To help us accomplish these tasks, we are joined by an excellent pool of private sector experts. Let me introduce them very briefly so we can proceed with their brief presentations. I'm sorry, I have to apologize in advance to our panelists. As I've mentioned, we hope to keep the presentations very brief and in a given time, so we would still have some room for discussions later. And to our audience, please join us by typing in your questions in the chat box, and we will try to go over them later or after the session. So first panelist is Dr. Peter Wu, CEO of ASUS Cloud. He has extensive experience in the computer hardware industry. The second panelist is Sarah English, Vice President for Global Public Policy of MasterCard. She is in charge of the company's Global Trade Policy and International Affairs programs. Next is Karen Kuman. She is the Director of Government Relations at IBM Australia, New Zealand. I had the privilege of prior engagement with Karen representing the Australia Services Roundtable, where she currently sits as director. ASR, along with TWCSI and my organization, Philippine Services Coalition, are members of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition. Last but certainly not the least in the panel is Winsley Bangit, the Chief Customer Officer of Mint, Globe Fintech Innovations, Inc. Winsley has over 17 years of work at Globe Telecom. Globe is the leading telecommunications service provider in the Philippines. And with that, let me call on Peter for his presentation on digitally enabled healthcare services. Peter, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everyone. The honor to have this presentation, and I would like to share my here. Okay, I would like to have a brief presentation to you from the perspective of digital health in Chinese Taipei. Okay, as you may know, digital health brings a lot of opportunities to ICT industry, not only in medical AI, but also for genomics, big data, precision medicine, or medical devices. We call this software as a medical device. And the reason the ICT industry, like us, would like to embrace digital health is because we can see that the expense of medical are moving from treatment to prediction or monitoring. That all from digital. And the service model of healthcare is also moving from in hospital, inner hospital to telecare, telemedicine. We call it virtual care. And for example, the ICT company like us, ASUS, set up different business units to embrace this opportunity, from wearable devices to medical AI. And for example, we are helping the biggest hospital in Chinese Taipei, NTUH, to help them to transform their emergency department into a digital-enabled department that the throughput of patient safety can be helped a lot. And you can see that from patient registration to diagnostic to examination to observation to discharge, all can be digitally enabled. And since 2020, the COVID-19 is accelerating a lot in digital health. And both during pandemic, and we can see that after pandemic, it will change digital health a lot as well. And you can see that, for example, telemedicine, the number of visits by telemedicine is 38 times than ever. And we can see that after pandemic, there should be a lot of monitoring activity to be delivered at home or remote. So COVID is changing digital health a lot. And we can also see that there are many challenges for widely adoption of digital health. I summarized 3 for you. And the first part is that hospital is a key user of digital health. And we can see hospitals are conservative in using new tech. For example, we have a blood pressure wearable devices bring to market 2 years ago, but the doctors are conservative because they are not familiar with this technology, and they would like to see others using before, and they would like to see that the government are pushing the new tech before. So in Chinese Taipei, our government put some efforts to help hospitals to embrace these technologies. For example, we give grants to hospital to give them some incentive to use the technology, and we are building a sandbox regulation that lower the concerns of the doctors. And the second part of the challenge is, of course, the government regulation. You know that telemedicine or medical data, personal data protection is the barriers of telemedicine. So our government is also considering open more telemedicine scenarios after pandemic, and we are preparing to bring new regulations to open to EHR. And the third barriers is that in Chinese Taipei, we have a single payer healthcare system. That means the payers need to support this kind of digital health scenario. But the good news is that last year, the NSI have a new initiative that they put new budget to telemedicine in Chinese Taipei. So in conclusion, we all agree that the vision of digital health or precision health is the future, both for healthcare industry and ICT industry. But we can also see lots of challenges also for industry, both for ICT and healthcare. And we can see a lot of, we can see some obstacles locally in Chinese Taipei or other countries. So for digital health, we need aggressive PPP, private-public participant, to solve this problem. And that's all my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Indeed, as in the previous session, the pandemic has helped accelerate the adoption and reach of digitally enabled services. And because of that, as you rightly pointed out, economies should consider opening up regulations on telecare and telemedicine and the use of medical data. I have to also stress your point on the need for public-private partnership. So from digital health, we move to financial services. Peter identified challenges to the ICT and healthcare industry in Chinese Taipei, and some are actually related to payments. So now let's see, perhaps we can learn from Sarah's presentation, particularly on cross-border payments. So now I turn over to Sarah.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to Chinese Taipei for inviting me. And I'm wondering if someone could put up my presentation, please. While that's being done, maybe what I'll do is I'll provide a little bit of an overview in what I mean by electronic payments, what we mean by digital payments, and then I'll talk about the opportunities and challenges. So, for all intents and purposes, payments really help drive consumer spending, accelerate economic activity, provide access to the digital economy for billions of individuals, millions of small and medium-sized enterprises. And cross-border payments in particular really is the glue of the digital economy. Now, while cash has accounted for about 18% of point-of-sale payment methods today, that number is expected to drop by less than 10% by 2025. And the pandemic has only accelerated the adoption of digital payments. And according to our own research, the shift to digital payment, 30% of the shift to digital payments is permanent. Next slide, please. So when we speak about electronic payments, essentially this is the value chain. you have the payer on one side, you have the payee on the other side. And all the interaction that happens in between, how the merchant gets paid, how the consumer presents their payments, is all provided by essentially the payment network, like a MasterCard. And underneath the core benefits are these value-added services, which I will get into a little bit of detail, which are everything from fraud monitoring to chargebacks. So next slide, please. So there are essentially two models of electronic payments, and I think this is where some folks get tripped up here. So there's the three-party model, which is essentially where the payment network also is the issuer, extends the credit to the consumer. And examples of that are Diners Club, American Express, Discover, and there are others as well. Next slide, please. The four-party model, which is where the payment network, like a MasterCard or a Visa or a JCB, sits in the middle of the issuer and the acquirer. And I'll get into a little more detail in terms of what the issuer and the acquirer are. Next slide, please. But essentially what a payment network is we authorize, clear, and settle transactions through our core network. And while we don't issue cards, that's the three-party model, or set interest rates, we do connect buyers and sellers. And we process about 113 billion transactions annually. Now, our consumers are generally banks or credit unions, but not consumers or merchants. And we are responsible for providing safety and security as well as timely payments and settlement guarantee, payment guarantee to the merchants. Now, it's really important to understand what types of data are in a payment transaction. So typically, the information that we receive from the merchant is just the information that is necessary to process the transaction. That data does not include the consumer's name, their address, their personal information. We also don't know what the consumer has purchased. We only know what the amount is, who the merchant is, and what form the payment was made. Next slide, please. But you know what, let's skip through these because I think folks might be familiar with the issuer and the acquirer. The issuer is responsible for basically extending the credit to the consumer. They take on most of the risk. They handle the actual processing of the payments between the banks. So next slide. The acquirer is responsible for recruiting merchants. They manage all the risk assessment for the merchants. They're responsible for actually making the payment to the merchants. And they handle all the information and chargebacks that happen between the merchant and the consumer. So next slide. I think this is probably the most important slide that I'm going to focus on because this is essentially the basic, next slide. This is essentially the basic functions of the electronic payment system to authorize, clear, and settle. Now, what I mean by authorization, that is at the time of purchase. So when the consumer goes to the merchant, they present their card or their digital payment. This is where MasterCard will come in between. We will pick up the transaction from the acquirer. It's sent to the payment network. We then take that information and we send it to the issuing bank, which is the cardholder's bank. We then transact with the issuing bank to say this cardholder is good. They're making a purchase online for this amount. We need to approve it. The issuer then sends back the information. We send it on behalf of the issuer to the merchant's bank, the acquirer, and the approval is made. Now, all this happens literally in a matter of seconds. And there's the value of the payment network. But this is just one piece of the actual transaction. This is just the authorization. If you go to the clearing section, this is where the information of reconciliation between the payment amount and the payment that's due happens. And then the settlement, which is the third piece of the payment authorization, is where the banks are actually settling between themselves, where the payments are actually being sent. So the consumer's account is debited, the payment is then sent to the merchant, and the merchant is actually paid. Now, depending on the situation, I can give you an example. If you're going to a hotel, you present your card, the hotel makes the authorization, and they place a hold on your account. And in a matter of days, it'll be actually cleared and settled. So this is just an example, but it's meant show that not all payment transactions are actually authorized, cleared, and settled in the same day. It depends on the type of transaction that occurs. Similarly, if you're taking an Uber and you take an Uber several times a day, Uber, as the merchant, has the right to actually not do each transaction as it occurs during the day, but they can actually batch the transactions and send it at the end of the day. Now, this is all just the flexibility that is built into the system that provides merchants flexibility, but consumers, again, a way to pay that's guaranteed. I think now I'll just turn quickly to opportunities and challenges. So as you can see, each step of the transaction, from initiating to processing to authorizing the payment, relies on data. And making the free flow of data is a critical prerequisite to a functioning international payments ecosystem. Companies large and small rely on the unobstructed transfer of cross-border data to provide their customers with innovative, intelligent, and secure products and services. And interoperability and common global standards are really critical to achieving economies of scale. Some of the challenges that payment networks face are data localization, routing restrictions, localization of operations, and national standards. We are very excited to see some of the work that is being done in APEC. And in particular, we are very supportive of the CPTPP, the Australia-Singapore DEA, and USMCA, and other digital trade agreements that really support market access, national treatment, and recognizing international standards. We believe that open and competitive EPS markets can increase consumption, drive economic growth, advance financial inclusion, which is really critical in this digital economy, and enable the economic success of small and medium-sized enterprises. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Indeed, I believe, as I've mentioned, there is in fact some convergence on the use of cross-border payments with the previous discussion on healthcare service delivery. More importantly, as you pointed out, it offers immense benefits to SMEs and vulnerable communities. So the presentation suggests, though, that critical to cross-border transactions is the free flow of data. And to talk more about this and other data-related issues, let me call on our next speaker, Karen. Karen Kumen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you to Chinese Taipei and the APEC economies for the opportunity to present today. I'd just like to note that I am standing in for Jane Drake Brockman, who's the Executive Director and founder of the Australian Services Roundtable, who's unable to participate due to COVID. And accordingly, I don't have a presentation, so I'll just speak to the key points. So please bear with me and I'll do my best. As no doubt you're all aware, COVID-19 has created unprecedented disruptions to the global economy, the full impact of which will not become clear for years to come. But the result is that the pandemic has accelerated what was already well underway, and that's the digitisation of the global economy, particularly digitally enabled services. Increased internet access and data flows were fueling this transformation long before the crisis. In fact, even before the pandemic, cross-border data flows made a bigger contribution to global GDP than trade in manufactured goods. But today, virtual engagement and interactions have become the new norm. And one wonders how we would have actually coped with the shutdowns caused by COVID-19 without the digital economy, which enabled hundreds of millions of people to deliver services remotely and work from home. In many cases, the pandemic has, as a result, spurred innovations and new delivery modes that will not be reversed. This is particularly so in the way in which we provided education services, medical and health services, which we've heard other speakers mention today, and entertainment services, as well as ordering goods. In the vast number of cases, the cost of delivering these services was also reduced significantly, providing greater margins to businesses and better reach. Between the start of the COVID-19 crisis and May 2022, demand for some of these services skyrocketed skyrocketed so much that, for example, broadband communication services increased at the record pace of some 60%, and some IT infrastructure, platform and mobile providers have reported increases in demand of up to 100% during the course of the pandemic. Now, whilst most businesses are keen to return to some pre-COVID in-person operations, it's clear that many digitally delivered services will never return fully to their pre-COVID mode, and some not at all. But as we know, the impact of COVID has not been consistent. While some businesses have thrived, others have disappeared altogether. So in this environment, if we are to recover as a global economy, digital services liberalisation is critical. And from a business perspective, this will require real work to be done to remove those barriers to digital services trade, and from a practical point of view, maximise regulatory consistency and interoperability. And by that, I mean some key areas that really impact on the way in which we can do business or prevent us from doing business. Urgent work is needed towards more consistent privacy laws, which are very expensive to implement. We need harmonisation of key e-commerce issues, such as the recognition of electronic signatures, online payments and lodgements, reducing restrictions on cross-border data flows, which others have referred to today, reducing the need for data localisation, and regulatory consistency in dealing with fraud and cybercrime. All important issues, but multiple types of regulation in this area which are inconsistent just add significant additional costs to business. Other issues that have become relevant in 21st century economies are environmental protection issues and gender inclusion. So maximising regulatory consistency in these important areas is also critical if digital trade is to thrive. But even though this may seem self-evident, paradoxically, as the internet and cross-border data flows have become more essential in the post-COVID world, there have been increasing calls for data sovereignty, mirroring renewed criticisms of world trade and fears regarding globalisation. Concerns raised by governments and individuals about the safety, security and use of data underscores the urgent need for new approaches to engender trust and confidence of the public in the digital economy. Now, the WTO and trade agreements are essential to counter this effort. And I would argue that given the size and potential of digital trade in this post-COVID era, there needs to be an even more focus on barriers to digital trade than traditional trade liberalisation issues as a matter of priority. Now, that is not to say that there's not been some good progress made. For the past decade, negotiators have made significant gains in developing new trade provisions to facilitate cross-border data flows and protect underlying intellectual property rights. And these include the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, and others. The WTO has also made some progress in this regard, particularly the e-commerce initiative under the leadership of Australia, Japan and Singapore. And in parallel to this, there's been some substantial efforts to enhance cybersecurity, privacy and data protection cooperation between governments and the private sector, such as the Data Free Flows with Trust initiative launched by then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at the 2019 G20. So it's clear that digital trade is a key feature of the negotiators and regulators' work. But for all of these efforts, the recent e-commerce moratorium battle for business was a frightening wake-up call that these battles are not going to be easily won. We cannot take them for granted. So moving forward, we would argue that we need a new post-COVID digital trade agenda that develops the digital rules of the road. And this agenda needs to strike a balance between safeguarding innovation and driving trade and engendering public trust. Without both, we will not succeed. Central to the digital trade agenda, and there are many issues that need to go in this bucket, but I've just chosen three core principles to highlight today, and that includes the first that others have mentioned, and ensuring the free flow of data. As global trade integration accelerates, companies of all sizes must be able to move data securely across borders to maintain operations, reach customers and compete. The trade agreements must include specific provisions protecting the movement of data across borders and ensure the ability of companies to operate without requiring them to use or establish their own infrastructure or build expensive and redundant data centres. The second one I would call out is the need to protect source code and algorithms. As data-driven solutions such as artificial intelligence become more ubiquitous, trade agreements must prohibit parties from requiring companies to hand over source code and algorithms as a condition for accessing a market. And the third is ensuring that companies have technology choice and that trade agreements encourage open digital architecture. And by that, by open digital architecture, I mean interoperable design specifications for hardware and software. Companies must be able to choose and utilise and build the technology that works best for their needs. The use of closed architecture prevents interoperability and diminishes competition and limits the ability of companies to benefit from cost-effective, secure and innovative technologies. So from our point of view, we would call on trade negotiators to ensure that trade agreements protect technology choice by encouraging the use of open architectures that will drive innovation in the new era of technologies such as cloud computing, AI and 5G telecommunications. So in summary, while it's impossible to predict what the future will hold, it is clear that data-driven technologies are becoming more essential to our daily life and work, and nothing is cemented that further than the COVID-19 pandemic. We call on the policymakers and trade negotiators in developing the next generation of digital trade principles to help us ensure that open standards, these key issues that I mentioned, the core principles of allowing the digital economy to grow and prosper and deliver us economic opportunities, innovation and prosperity are integrated into the future trade negotiators program. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I couldn't agree more that addressing these barriers to the digital ecosystem, the privacy rules, data localization, cybersecurity, the e-commerce duties, of course, as well as your points on the source code, the choice of technology for companies, among others, involve an all-systems approach, not just within, but among economies in the region and beyond. And yes, as you pointed out, there are some regulations in place but needs revisiting, as these rules altogether are often inconsistent, unpredictable, and unharmonious. So from a regional scale, let us look at specific cases, such as in the Philippines, on how digitally enabled services can have a huge impact on millions of people scattered in thousands of islands. Of course, the challenge and opportunities are shared by other economies in the region and also by APEC as a region. So as for our next panelist, Winsley, over to you. Hi, Winsley. I think your speaker is on mute.
Is this okay? Okay, good. Sorry, I had a minor hiccup in my audio. But again, thank you, Patrick, and hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, and thank you to Chinese Taipei and the APEC economies for inviting us. And we are here to talk about the benefits and challenges of digitally enabled services, especially in the Philippine setting, and again, can be relevant to other potentially developing economies. So I hope everyone is safe and healthy in their respective locations. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce ourselves first. We are GCash. We are the #1 mobile wallet in the Philippines and the only fintech double unicorn in the country. And we are the game-changing super app that makes financial and digital lifestyle services easy, convenient, and accessible in the country. We have more than 60 million registered users in our ecosystem and more than 6 million merchants and online sellers. We believe in making Filipinos' lives better every day as more and more Filipinos use GCash as their own personal digital life hack. However, the challenge remains on how we serve the unbanked and the underbanked, especially in a developing economy like the Philippines. Just so you know, the Philippines is still underpenetrated in banking, with 65% of Filipinos not owning any form of bank account, even less than 5% owning credit cards or investments. It is a very small number, and convincing them, Filipinos scattered over an archipelagic region, to adopt digital financial solutions was initially one of our greatest challenges. However, we were determined to enable the underserved population by providing them with products that could make impact in their daily lives. The Philippines is uniquely positioned to capture this massive digital opportunity, as Filipinos are technologically enabled digital natives. Uniquely, the Philippines have a high smartphone and internet penetration. 65% of adults are already using a smartphone, and 72% of the population using the internet, making the Philippines one of the biggest social media adopters in the world. But the question remains, how do we get a digital but underbanked population to adopt a digital wallet solution? And at the end of the day, it's all about impact and the benefit in their daily lives. And it is manifested through accessibility, relevance, and affordability. Now, let me first discuss accessibility. Being a digital enabler, GCash was able to reach more areas in the region, especially during the pandemic when restrictions in mobility kicked in. We don't have a brick and mortar capability. People with smartphones can just download us and then provide relevant digital services for them. The lockdowns limited not just mobility. Individuals lost their jobs and a lot of traditional offline businesses closed. With GCash, it was easier to empower many underserved Filipinos and businesses into finding more opportunities with the financial and business solutions that we had to offer. One even said that because of GCash, they were able to set up a business, even with all the restrictions of the pandemic, because it was convenient, safe to just open digital payment transactions without having to go through long processes of application. Speaking of businesses, of course, a lot of businesses were scrambling to digitalize as well their operations during the pandemic, and many needed accessible and safe digital payment platforms. A lot quickly turned to us to provide that solution. In fact, for many MSMEs, we became a lifeline, supporting the payment infrastructure in order for this business to continue, not just to stay open, but to expand beyond the reach of their traditional brick and mortar operations. On average, our base transacts to around 2.5 social sellers per month. And then we acknowledge that now GCash transactions has become the main method of payment for many Filipinos and many small businesses. Because of that, we will continue our efforts in making GCash more accessible to our merchants and customers by building an ecosystem around the country, both offline and online. Now, apart from accessibility, I also want to talk about relevance. When the pandemic first hit, there were no blueprints as to where we were going. But to stay on course, we made sure to provide relevant products by making our customers our number one compass. So for example, we became a digital essential during lockdown by helping customers send money to their loved ones despite the limitations in movement. They were now able to still pay their bills online. They were able to do a lot of their financial transactions at the comforts and safety of their own homes. Also, when the government was having a hard time dispersing government aid, we stepped in and helped and became one of the official government disbursement channels, disbursing more than 16 billion pesos of government aid to 2 million Filipinos. Also, when many wanted to donate, right, because of, again, calamities and all the restrictions that we're having, we became also a digital donations hub, raising over 40 million pesos, supporting more than 370 organizations in the country. We also help transform traditions, regular traditions like Christmas gift giving, holidays, even Mother's Day, Father's Day celebrations that were limited during those strict lockdowns, and we were able to transform them to digital. We also became the main source of financial solutions with products such as insurance, savings, investments, and credits, and loans. We continue to help entrepreneurs by ramping our e-commerce platforms. And lastly, we didn't forget about our overseas Filipinos, and we expanded our remittance service to them so now they could send their remittances easily, directly to their GCash recipients here in the Philippines. By providing help for our customers, we remained relevant and supported our growth up until now. And last but not least, I'd like to discuss affordability. In a country where minimum wage per day is only around $10, affordability is key. But Filipinos are still relatively intimidated by financial services, such as investments, insurance, because of costs, because of documentary requirements. But again, we are very conscious in making a lot of these services affordable. Now, many consumers can easily buy insurance for as low as 50 pesos, or that's almost $1. Invest in local funds, again, for only as low as 50 pesos, and even start their own bank accounts without going to an actual branch. In fact, 77% of UITF in the Philippine market is now with GCash, and we have disbursed more than 2 billion pesos in loans to more than 1 million recipients. Truly, because of how affordable it is, customers can easily grow, extend, and protect their wealth all within their fingertips, anytime, anywhere with GCash. Again, well, being digital has helped us become more accessible, affordable, and relevant. The challenge remains in serving the underbanked Filipino segment, and we will continue in our mission to change that and democratize financial services in the Philippines with technological and digital solutions as we continue to make the lives of Filipinos better every day. So, thank you very much for allowing us to share the benefits of digitalization in the Philippine setting.
Thank you very much, Winsley. Indeed, GCash story shows us how further liberalizing digitally enabled services can open vast opportunities to people, to businesses, big and small, and to the economy, especially the developing ones like the Philippines. I guess what stood out for me in your presentation was that part where you emphasize being and staying relevant, where GCash transcends to just being an e-wallet and e-payments system provider, but being part of the lifestyle. There surely are many stories like this around the region, and we need to tell those. We need more stories, best cases, and so that we can offer solution to our policymakers. And with that, I hope we still have time for short Q&A. I see some questions on chat. Let me ask the panelists back, and please try to make your answers as brief as possible. So I see question here for, I think this is for Peter, about local hospitals being NPOs and how is it an obstacle. So, can you provide a brief response to these, please?
Okay, thank you, Patrick. The question is why the local hospital are NPO, and why is that an obstacle? And my experience is that doctors in hospitals, I mentioned that they are conservative, and they are conservative about the first thing is about the data privacy. They are concerning if they are adopting digital technologies, devices, services. Is there any chance that they will break some laws, that they may face some troubles in the future? And the other issues for them is I may say that in Chinese Taipei or some Asian countries, doctors are familiar with, or they are willing to use good product from States or European. They have little incentive to use new technologies because they are concerned about patient safety or other regulations. So these are the obstacles. And for NPOs in Chinese Taipei, large hospitals, I can say that half of larger hospitals are NPO in Chinese Taipei. And this may limit their imagination that they want to do some service model innovations. I may say that they are concerned about patient, but for digital, for service innovation, these are not their priority. So that's all my answers. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, interesting point. You mentioned about regulations, and I think this is there's related to this is a question which I think the other panelists can respond. I think Sarah or Karen would have some thoughts on this about private sector compliance to government regulations. Are there some, perhaps one, two best practice or cases such as a sandbox? I understand there are some regulatory sandboxes that we discuss in APEC. Any particular point about this, Sarah and Karen?
Well, I'm not sure I've got examples of best practices. I've got lots of examples of poor practices, and that would be where economies look at regulation from a very narrow perspective. They might look at cybersecurity from a security perspective, but they don't see the impact that may have on code development, or what the impact it may have on innovation, or the impact it may have on cross-border data trade of products. So it's taking a very narrow lens and seeking to achieve one social or policy outcomes without realizing the impact across the board. And I think some countries do that too, some economies do that as well, where they're trying to achieve specialization and skill development in ICT in particular, and that sometimes is a rationale for requiring local investment or local data centres to try and build up the expertise, but in fact it has other consequences. So I'm not sure we've got a lot of, I've got a best practice to share or highlight, but certainly some concerns that need to be taken into account that include the ones I've just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah?
I agree. I don't have anything to add, but I actually want to answer the third question around technology choice and open architecture, because I think it's a very important one, especially in the digital payments space. And I think a great example of having industry-led standards on technology, specifically on payments, for instance. The standards that we operate our networks and our systems are industry-led. It's why GCash has been able to flourish in the Philippines. They're leveraging these open standards that anyone can code to and create innovation. And that's, I think, very, very important for governments to understand. If you're prescriptive and you create these national standards, and every single country has their own national standard, that is basically going to collapse the digital economy. You have to have open, just like in the physical world, you have open borders for goods. You need open borders for services in the digital world. And by doing that is by having open standards, open architecture, because it allows more innovation and it breeds more innovation.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I guess as GCash was alluded to, Winsley, any thoughts or points you want to share about what made GCash work in terms of the regulations that is out there for you?
Yeah. Definitely, on the regulatory point of view, there is, I call, a very forward-looking regulatory environment, only because the government and the regulators are really focused on unlocking and serving a lot of the underbanked. So it echoes a national objective to have a more financially inclusive environment. And I guess behind that, they know and they believe that technology and open architectures, open standards, collaborative environments would be key, right? And I guess, again, like what I said, the context is we are an archipelagic nation, right? The Philippines. A lot is underserved. And for us to be able to really bring on and fast track the velocity of inclusion, collaboration, partnership, and these types of more really forward-looking regulations is key. And again, we're happy and we're glad to be in that type of environment. And again, hence a very healthy ecosystem, both of fintech, banks, and a lot of digital and financial institutions in the country.
Yeah. Speaking of regulation, let me end our session, as I know we're a bit running late on time, by asking the panelists, and again, please be very, very brief. I wish to ask about that regulation. What would be one issue, or if you already have a specific recommendation in mind, wish list perhaps, that if addressed or if implemented will be provides a very big push to the industry or to the economy, to the company perhaps. Let me put it in the order of our presentations. Peter, Sarah, Karen, and Winsley. Very brief, please. Thank you.
Ajay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
I was asking about what would be that one thing or one wish you have that if addressed or perhaps you have one specific recommendation that, if addressed or if implemented, the healthcare industry, the ICT industry in Chinese Taipei would
Thank you.
very.
My recommendation, especially for APEC, is that we can see that after COVID pandemic, there are a lot of demands for telemedicine, and there will be a lot regulation discussion needed. So my recommendation is that APEC can host or deliver more such as discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Well, I guess my one ask, which I think APEC is actually delivering on, is on the uninhibited access to cross-border data flows and prohibiting data localization, but then also ensuring non-discrimination for these digitally enabled services is really important.
Thank you. Karen?
I was going to talk about cross-border data flows, but that's taken. So I will use this chance to say that my one great wish would be that we would have across the APEC economies a greater regulatory consistency in relation to a number of key issues, including privacy and general e-commerce regulation and acknowledgement of digital signatures and the like.
Thank you. And of course, Winsley?
Yep. So I guess a lot has been said, but I'd like to echo really inclusion. As we form all of these regulations, policies across nations, across markets, definitely we know that various markets are in different levels of development. So again, I'd like to call on all of our regulatory making bodies within the region to make sure that we also be mindful of those who are, so that no one gets left behind, right? In all of our regulations.
With that, let me just again thank you all our panelists, Peter, Sarah, Karen, Winsley, our guests who raised their questions. And with that, let me highlight the points raised by our esteemed panelists just very quickly. And to me, that is, there's huge potential and opportunity to seize with opening up services, particularly in digitally enabled ones. And some buts, we need to enhance the digital infrastructure and the regulatory environment. In particular, remove the barriers to free flow of data, and we can better promote adoption of digital technology and innovation by ensuring data and data flow is reliable and secured. While governments will create the policies and enforce them, private sector and concerned stakeholders' inputs are critical to ensure that the policy environment, as Karen mentioned, should be consistent and is enabling and facilitative for both within the industry, consumers, economies, and across, as we are talking of APEC here. So with that, as also pointed out, strong public-private partnership engagement is necessary. And again, let me now turn over to Linda as we end and proceed to our next session. Again, thank you very much, all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cha, for moderating the session for us. And thank you to all panelists for sharing your insights with us. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to panel discussion, where we will explore recommendations for post-pandemic regulatory planning. And the moderator for this session is Dr. Roy Lee, Senior Deputy Executive Director of the Taiwan WTO and RTA Center, Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research from Chinese Taipei. I will now hand the floor over to the moderator, Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you for staying with us towards the end of today's PPD. And for the next 20 minutes or so, we would like to try to forge and develop some recommendations for APEC to move forward on the issues of services sector digitalization. In the last two sessions, we heard perspective and experiences from both the private and the public sectors on how digital how the pandemic is facilitating the development of digitalization of services sectors, and we also heard experiences regarding the challenges and limitations and other perspectives, and also market development. And Anthony from the last session actually invited most of the speakers to come up with some concrete recommendations. But for this session, actually, we have provided our panelists with two major areas that we seek for their recommendations. The first area is how can we keep the momentum? How can we sustain the developments or the rapid development of digital services sector digitalization that took place during the pandemic beyond the pandemic? For example, we asked the panelists to share what they consider as essential elements to be considered by APEC governments in policy formulations relating to services sector digitalization, and also what are the best practices or what's the best recommended policy approaches for the governments to take actions to facilitate digital transformation of the services sector. And the second dimension, we invite them to provide recommendations on the regulatory cooperation and coherence. We understand that different APEC economies introduce different practices from liberalization to limitations or even restrictions on digitalization or digital transformation of the services sectors. Different economies have different priority areas and they have different approaches. And many of these considerations are related to regulatory objectives and regulatory regimes that each APEC economy have in place. So what we seek the panelists' recommendation on, what will be the best practices to work in the APEC as a region to cooperate and also to promote regulatory coherence across different APEC economies as a way, as a regional collective efforts to accelerate the digital transformation of the services sector. So that's the two, but we are not limiting our panelists to confine their recommendation only to these two dimensions. They are just two areas that we would like to seek their focus for this panel discussion, to hear their recommendations to move forward on this agenda. So let me start by, we have 4 panelists join these panel discussions, and all of them have already spoken during the last 2 sessions, so I'm not going to introduce them, their credentials and other information. For the first panelist, I would like to invite Dr. Peter Wu, the CEO of ASUS Cloud, to provide your views on policy recommendations for APEC digitalization of services sector. Peter, you have the floor. Thank you. Peter, are you with us? I'll probably come back to Peter later on. Well, maybe I'm not having an updated sequence of the speakers, but I already saw Deborah from RegTech Association Australia online with us. So Deborah, would you like to take the floor first on your recommendations for this panel discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. My sound is a little bit patchy, so I think you would like me to speak now. And what I might do, if that's okay with you, if I can address both of the questions that were posed to us in one block, because I have a hard stop in about 20 minutes. Is that okay?
Of course, perfect.
Okay, excellent. So I think in terms of the first question about the essential elements to be considered in our, policy formulation. I think one of the things that is clear, and we've been hearing it all through the presentations today, is that we cannot revert to the previous way of working and delivering services to citizens, in what we were doing in pre-pandemic times. Workforces have changed. Remote working is here to stay. I think the need for identity solutions, know your customer, e-discovery, how we find our important regulation and where is our data being stored, and even down to how we attract talent must be now part of a very important digitisation journey and adoption. And I spoke of before as well, we need to consider things such as environmental, social and governance, impacts. And these are important considerations as there's supply chains and being impacted, and we want to elevate good business principles. And further to that, I think collaboration is really key, and a deep understanding of what technology solutions that can aid more financial inclusion, promote trust across the ecosystems, and help regulators with their oversight duties and activities. But also being aware that policymakers actually really create the need for regulatory technology in the first place in making the laws and regulatory policies. And so it's an open question and an invitation for us to start exploring what moves are being made to digitise the law in the first instance, because this would promote greater interoperability and promote open source architecture, which one of the speakers spoke so eloquently around earlier. And one of the other important levers that we have around policy, I think, and in terms of the public to private partnership is the concept of the non-profit industry and trade organisations like my own that can actually help as an independent body to reduce some of the friction between institutions, regulators and government, and to promote digital trade and even help to develop standards, as has also been alluded to. And on the second point, my organisation would support, the discovery and education, a discovery and education phase, if you like, to leverage the RegTech powerhouse that we believe that the APEC economies actually have at their disposal right now. It's a matter of elevating that. Let's collect some data and get some research to showcase some of the best practice that's been talked about, and we could even do an APEC tech sprint as an idea to elevate that best practice and actually help economies be able to open up to the potential possibilities. So they were just some early ideas that I had around the two things that were posed to us. Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think RegTech is a great idea. In Chinese Taipei, my personal experience is regulators are always kind of lagging behind in adopting of digital technologies. But we also witness the fact that the public services sector are the sector that we are witnessing the most advanced developments in terms of introducing digital facilitation measures. So not turning back and keep moving forward probably is the message. And more importantly, I think regulator to regulator dialogue is equally important, as you recommended. They provide confidence and comfort zones for each other, but we do need people like you to introduce to them how public service can be incorporated with technologies. And thank you very much for your recommendations. And I hope Peter from ASUS Cloud is with us now.
Hey, Dr. Lee.
Oh, thank you very much. Great. So, Peter, we have the two major categories of questions seeking your recommendations, and I'm now giving you the floor. Thank you.
Okay. So for the, I'm sorry, Dr. Lee, for the recommendation, right?
Yes, for the recommendations. Yes.
Yeah. During the last session, I discussed some recommendation for digital health. We in Chinese Taipei, we also do some smart city project as well. So we face a lot of regulatory constraints, or how to deal with public sectors to embrace digital services. So as I mentioned, that PPP is very important for us to it's a concept to solve this problem, that we need to negotiate with the government how to design the business model, or how to deliver good service model, and how to leverage their effort to lower the concerns about several stakeholders. So, of course, my first recommendation is that the PPP is a good concept, good tool for us to do more. And my second recommendation is also for RegTech, because in Chinese Taipei, we also exploring some blockchain-oriented solutions for that. Especially in digital health, we are exploring some project that embracing blockchain technologies to strengthen the trust between different stakeholders in the healthcare industry. So RegTech is another good tool for us to face these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wu. Next, because I just take note of the time, and we are actually really behind the schedule. So I would like to invite our next speaker, Anthony, from the convener from the Asia Pacific Services Coalition, and also the moderator for the second session, to share with us his recommendations. Anthony,
Yes,
the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm also speaking as a private sector, and taking off from the earlier discussion. First, I couldn't agree more with Peter's emphasis on the need for public-private partnerships, for cooperation, as well, Deborah, on and you, of course, on the need for this constant public-private dialogues. So first, I wanted to point it out that we should take advantage of digital technology and innovation. And with that, let me reiterate my earlier point from the discussion, that to harness the huge potential and opportunity offered by digitally enabled services, we need regulatory coherence, but it is important to address the basics, especially in the case of the developing economies like the Philippines, and that is the need to build and strengthen the digital infrastructure, because that will provide a stable foundation for the regulatory environment that one needs to be sound and enabling in the most practical sense. By practical, I say, because we often discuss about regulations. We always agree that restrictions are a no-no, and yet, as in the earlier presentations by OECD, and that restrictions keep piling up. So there must be something wrong, or something that we are not addressing, why this is so. So repeatedly, we need to remove the barriers, so that in this day and age, the flow of data is free and hampered, while the data itself is reliable and secured. But again, it brings us to let's make sure that the policies that we we put forward in the strictest sense and in the most practical way is really offering us that benefit. So I think we need to have like a check and recheck and revisit the policies that we have and ensure that really are they the ones that's needed and necessary. For that, we need the inputs from the private sector, the stakeholders, so that the feedback will be unfiltered and in the most honest way, so that we can now work and focus on the things and ensure that the benefits will be delivered. I guess I'll have to stop for that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for sharing. Someone just sent me a link like 10 minutes ago, sharing the news that the United Kingdom has just concluded a data pact cooperation with South Korea. The name of the agreement is Data Adequacy Decision. It is actually the first UK agreement on data transfer and data movement across the border, and ensuring the quality and the protection, as you just mentioned. So I think now we are seeing some examples of these concrete regulatory coherence efforts. And thank you very much for the recommendation that we are now picking up a lot of new elements to move forward beyond today's event. Thank you. Last but not least, I would like to invite Wensley and Jet to share with you the recommendations on the two areas. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Roy. A lot has been said already, and I just want to add and not echo a lot, but definitely an enabling and forward-looking regulatory environment, which means, I said it earlier, an inclusive agenda, ensuring that the smallest of participants are heard and included. Technology also is key. I guess the thrust is not for regulations to be platform or technology led, but should be industry and sector and agenda or objectives led, rather than technology or platforms. And lastly, and we've seen this already in something, I think this is something that all of us should continue doing, the openness and the sandbox approach of regulations, because of course we don't know what's out there. Nobody will be experts in where all of us will be going. So we just need to foster innovation through all of this sandbox, walled garden approach, so that we could learn fast as an industry.
Thank you. I think that your recommendation on this industry or sector-led development is well taken. I think it's actually very important. I mean, that's probably the spirit of this public-private cooperation or partnership, right? So we let the market, the demand side, the consumer, and the providers of services to lead the process of digitalization, rather than dominated by technologies or dominated by regulatory objectives, right? So finding the right balance and not being dominated by technologies, very important, well taken. And also the openness of regulation. I think the COVID-19 provides some confidence for regulators, to move to carry on the liberalization or taking a more ambitious step. And sandbox provide a kind of insurance or safeguard measures to create comfort zone for regulators to continue the efforts. Yeah, so that's again thank you very much for these very good recommendations. Thanking the four panelists today with us. The main points or recommendation I picked up includes let's move forward and never reverse the path back to the pre-pandemic world. The world's very different. Workforce is different. The mode of work is very different. Technology is very different, and we all all consumers and citizens from the APEC region have tested the benefits of digitalization, the convenience of digitally enabled services provisions. So I think there's no way to turn back the clock now. So in order to move forward, we need a strong to forge an even stronger public-private partnership mechanism, perhaps under the APEC umbrella and other regional efforts. We need to provide more confidence for regulators to find a balance of introducing digitalized measures while at the same time maintaining their regulatory objectives. So more dialogues between regulators are equally important. And also to ensure industrial sector-led progress is important. And most importantly, we need to have more conversation and dialogues between, not only between private and public sectors, but my personal view is even more important between the regulators and the regulators, so that this hybrid architecture will ensure a digital transformation of the services sector within the APEC region will be continue to sustain the acceleration momentum that we witnessed in the last 3 years. Oh, thank you very much for your very well taken recommendations, and I think we'll end this session here, and I'll turn back to Linda. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for moderating the session for us, and thank you to all panelists for a very animated panel discussion. Thank you. To conclude today's webinar, we would like to invite Ms. Antonia May, CTI Representative and Director of Multilateral Trade Affairs at the Bureau of Foreign Trade under Ministry of Economic Affairs of Chinese Taipei, for her closing remarks. Ms. May, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my appreciation to the moderators and speakers for your valuable presentations and inputs, and thank all participants today. This dialogue has offered a good opportunity to learn about better identifying and responding to emerging challenges and opportunities arising from digitally enabled services. I would like to share with you some takeaways from this dialogue, which I believe will enhance our future work. Firstly, there is an urgent need for APEC member economies to focus more on the enormous opportunities for services that are presented through digital transformation and utilizing digital technologies to enhance services competitiveness. Secondly, the flow of data underpins the development of digitally enabled services. Greater cooperation is needed to develop coherent strategies for cross-border data flow while ensuring appropriate privacy protection. Thirdly, it's important to bridge the digital divide by facilitating access to ICT services and upgrading digital skills. Fourthly, governments should make a concerted effort to engage with private sectors to learn their experience, to know their needs, so as to facilitate the formulation of policies. Last but not least, APEC needs to strengthen cross-border collaboration to ensure better synergy between ACR and ADA to unlock digital opportunities. Finally, I would like to convey my special gratitude to member economies and the Secretariat for your support to make this event successful. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Ms. May, for your closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the webinar on the Public-Private Dialogue on Digitally Enabled Services. Thank you very much for your participation. We would like to invite all participants to please take a few minutes to fill in our survey by scanning the QR code or by clicking on the link in the chat room and provide us with your valuable feedback and suggestions. We will put the link up pretty soon in the chat box, so please do click on the link and provide us with your feedback. Your feedback is highly appreciated. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. We wish you great health and prosperity. Goodbye, everyone.